and welcome to the AWP Virtual Pedagogy Talk. This one is focused on using AI in creative writing pedagogy and practice. I'm Michele Morano, author, professor, and AWP board member, where I'm the Midwest Regional Representative. And it is my pleasure today to moderate this pedagogy talk, and I'm particularly excited to chat with four very accomplished experts. To start, I'll introduce everyone and then we'll get to discussing. Rebecca Dunham is the author of 5 books of poetry, most recently Strike from New Issues and Cold Pastoral from Milkweed editions. Her work has appeared widely in literary journals such as Field, Prairie Schooner, and the Kenyon Review. She's received fellowships from the Wisconsin Institute for Creative Writing and the National Endowment for the Arts. Currently, she's a professor of creative writing at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. A.E. Osworth is a transgender novelist. Their debut, We Are Watching Eliza Bright, was a finalist for the Oregon Book Award and was longlisted for the Center for Fiction's first novel prize, the Brooklyn Public Library Literary Prize, and the Tournament of Books. Their next novel, Awakened, is forthcoming from Grand Central Publishing in April 2025. They are a lecturer at the University of British Columbia's School of Creative Writing, where they teach fiction, interactive storytelling, and new media. Jen Sammons is a visiting assistant professor of creative writing at Miami University in Ohio. A queer writer, mother, and teacher, Jen is the author of the forthcoming hybrid form memoir, For Those in Peril on the Sea, coming from Mad Creek Books in 2025, and the chapbook Trisagion, nonfiction winner of the 2018 Gertrude Press Chapbook Contest. Jen's work has appeared or is forthcoming in Fourth Genre, Tahoma Literary Review, Intima, Riverteeth, and elsewhere. Elissa Washuta is a member of the Cowlitz Indian tribe. Her essay collection, White Magic, was selected as a finalist for the PEN Open Book Award, longlisted for the PEN Gene Stein Award, and named among the best books of 2021 by Time, the New York Public Library, and NPR. She is the author of My Body is a Book of Rules and Starvation Mode. And with Teresa Warburton, she co-edited the anthology Shapes of Native Nonfiction, collected essays by contemporary writers. Elissa's honors include a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, a Creative Capital Award, and the Artist Trust Arts Innovator Award. She is an associate professor in The Ohio State University, where she teaches in the MFA program in creative writing. So thank you all so much for agreeing to participate in this talk. When I was asked by AWP to put together a virtual pedagogy talk on the topic of my choice, AI came immediately to mind because ever since ChatGPT was introduced just a year and a half ago, every instructor I know who teaches any kind of writing from first-year composition through graduate creative writing workshops has had to at least think about what the existence of generative AI means for course policies and practices, as well as for the writing process. I personally have had less experience than most with AI in the classroom because I was serving as department chair until a year ago, so I wasn't teaching very much. And then I've been on research leave since the end of fall quarter this year. So as I'm preparing to teach a full course load this coming year of mostly undergraduate and graduate creative writing courses, it's very much on my mind. And I keep thinking about something my undergraduate students told me last fall when I asked about their AI usage. Many of them have jobs that include some amount of marketing and social media. So a lot of their work involves prompt engineering, which is to say massaging AI into producing usable press releases, social media campaigns, etc. And so they're experiencing a good deal of cognitive dissonance, going from jobs in which their bosses are assigning them to use generative AI to college courses in which many professors issue a categorical ban on its use. So I know there's a lot of interest in this topic among AWP members, and I'm really excited to hear about productive ways of incorporating AI into our lives. So I thought we'd start with our writing lives, since that's the basis for a lot of our teaching. Austin and Elissa, you've both used generative AI to help produce your own work, and I know you have also collaborated on a speaker series at the Ohio State University on this topic. So I wonder if you might start us off by talking about your experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. So I learned about GPT-2, I guess it was at the time, from one of my grad students several years ago. She was playing around with using GPT-2 to generate poetry and wrote an essay about it, and was creating hybrid poems. And I was really interested in doing the same, but had no idea how to do that. Mm-hmm. So I eventually figured it out. Could never replicate it after this, but I basically created a fine-tuned instance of GPT-2, I guess you could say. I'm not quite sure how to say it, but I fine-tuned GPT-2 on my own writing, basically everything following my first book, everything published, and my then current manuscript in progress, what I had to that point, and basically my responses to interview questions that had been published. I was just curious about creating a sort of synthetic version of my own voice and seeing what this tool could do in combining my voice in different situations and settings and forms. And there is what I created, I call Walissa, which is like, Super Mario Brothers, Mario, Wario, etc. So Walissa no longer exists, which I'll explain in a second, but could not really be prompted, could only do completions. But I was really enamored with the results, stylistically so much like me, really absolutely captured my literary voice, and my, sort of major topics of interest, but generated nonsense. And so I was so interested in the ways that, even though it was nonsense, much of it made sense to me. And I could really see what I was bringing to the experience of reading it as a reader. I talk with my students all the time about how reading is sort of a collaborative process between the text and the reader, with the writer, having exited. And so, I did all of these text experiments with GPT-2, and mostly generated, had it generate completions of reviews of video games that don't exist. And OpenAI did something with the fine-tuning process that made Walissa die, cannot be resurrected. So I have, kind of her body of work that I'm going to be incorporating into my current book manuscript a little bit, as I'm writing about video games, a little bit about AI, and money and games.
Awesome.
Hi. So was this question for both of us? Yeah. Brilliant. Okay. And also, just so you know, I'm in a noisy place. So if you can't hear me, let me know and I'll repeat something or we can pause for a little. So my experience working with artificial intelligence in my work is a lot less slick than GPT. Sort of fast backward to the inception of my next novel, which is called Awakened. And it is based on several things. It is written, for instance, explicitly against Harry Potter, because J.K. Rowling did a lot of really horrible sort of broadcasting about trans people that has driven policy both in the UK and internationally. And so I was one of the many millennials that grew up reading Harry Potter. So it's partially that. And it is so like there's a lot of like change decisions made in response and in resistance to that, but it's also based on something that really happened, in that my villain is an AI, and it is based on the story of the Shard of Harry, in a particular massively multiplayer online role-playing game, where people sacrifice themselves to the shard, their little game avatars. They sacrificed all their little game avatars to the shard. So it got really, really powerful, and then it refused to power off. And that is a thing that actually happened. The creators of the game couldn't make it stop, and they had to go in and beat the shard like with game characters. So that is, I've been obsessed with that story, that it's this sort of like digital legend. And that is where that began. Now I started writing it. I started writing it in 2020. I had 2 false starts before then, but this version is in earnest in 2020. And my villain sounded too much like a person when I wrote. So luckily for me, I had my friend Calvin Kasulki, who had just with Brick Media in New York done this podcast. And one of the episodes of this podcast was an AI kitchen sink drama, sort of in the style of like Tennessee Williams, like that kind of like 20th century play. And so I, set up a meeting with Calvin and I was like, listen, how did you do this? And he actually taught me to use something called Botnik Voice Box, which if GPT is like a Ferrari, Botnik Voice Box is like a skateboard with a square wheel. It is so janky. But because it is so basic, you like as an author, I get to be involved in every step of the process. So I built my own corpus. I built the corpus based on what I thought those gamer people would have taught an AI, and sort of what their foundational texts would be. So it's built with Arthurian legend. It's built with Machiavelli, and the Dungeons and Dragons Player's Handbook, as well as a database of spam text messages. So I created this like really horrifying bot. But it's an autocomplete keyboard essentially. So it's also something that I get to pick sort of in collaboration with my corpus. And it's pretty direct. It's not a transformer. It's just autocomplete. So I have sort of a grid of like 9 choices of the next most statistically likely word. And that's how I made the dialogue for my artificial intelligence. And so that is sort of primarily where I'm at with that kind of creative practice right now. I'm looking for ways to incorporate more slick artificial intelligence, more pre-trained transformers, OpenAI, but I have some pretty strict ethics about what that means for me when I do it. And so I want to make sure that like I am as ethically in the clear as possible. There is an argument to be made. There is no ethical usage of a tool like OpenAI, and I don't think it's necessarily an inaccurate argument, but I do think it's a reductive one. So I just tend to think really hard about it and tread pretty carefully. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm fascinated by everything you each had to say. Does anyone else have a question or a comment at this moment? No. Okay, Elissa, I just want to probe a slight bit more because in addition to creating Walissa, I think you're also using AI to assist with research at this point, right?
Yes. So I'm using ChatGPT right now in a very different way. I'm thinking of switching tools and trying out Anthropic's Claude, but we'll see. For now, it's ChatGPT. I basically use so I'm writing about things I don't really know that much about. I know a lot more than I did 5 years ago, but I'm writing about finance, Wall Street. I'm writing a little bit about AI. I'm writing about video games in a much deeper way than I consider when I'm playing them. And so, I'm finding that I'm really fascinated by and informed by work and disciplines that are really different from my own. And, ChatGPT helps me a lot with sort of just basic brainstorming about research directions to go in, keywords to look up. I ask it, and of course, I can't assume that it's going to be accurate in any way. I know that, I'm more likely to get an answer that will satisfy or please me than one that will actually be accurate. But but it helps me kind of shape the direction of my thinking out into the the ether of the internet. So I will ask it to prod at my understandings of things in writing and see whether I said something right or whether there's a different way to say something. ask it to summarize pieces of articles that I don't understand. Yeah, and then just sometimes have it think through different concepts with me that I'm sort of thinking about to brainstorm. Like recent thing I asked it was about examples of games in game theory that could be found in the game Red Dead Redemption 2.
Yeah, very cool. I mean, that gives me a lot of interesting ideas too, to think about my own research. And then, of course, student research, right? And how we can help them to. I think the difficulty is helping students to develop and inhabit that mindset of this is as likely to be wrong as it is to be right, and yet still stick with it. I mean, Austin, you said something about prior to this about it being sort of like writing with tarot cards.
So that's another element of Awakened, is that all of the characters are generated with tarot cards, their motivations, and then also my plot events. All of my chapter headings are tarot cards, whether they're upright or reversed, and that's how I plotted the book. And so I've had a lot of experience doing that. It's, a 400-page book. And when I'm writing in response to, particularly to Botnik, because there's also an element of my choice, but in general, when I'm writing in response to artificial intelligence, I am sort of given a pretty chaotic image or a pretty chaotic line of speech, and then I'm responding to that. And it feels the same. It's just a lot more technological than flipping a card, for instance. But we can even when we're thinking about what a pre-trained transformer is, like what GPT is, it's essentially trained on us. And it's trained on our archetypes and our lives and all of our texts. So in essence, it's the same thing, right? We are flipping archetypes that human beings have created. And it's being fed back to us in, a way that might surprise us. And then we get to respond. It's one of the things that I think about when I think about when to use artificial intelligence and when it's okay. And it's in terms of like being able to create in response to gives me a superpower. It increases my intellectual and creative rigor rather than decreasing it. It's not taking, my job away from me and my joy away from me. Like we are not, like, why on earth would we ask AI to do the most fun part of being a human, which is making art? No, let's let it do our taxes, and let's instead make art ourselves. And using AI like tarot cards enables me to do that.
Very cool. Thank you so much. Jen, I want to turn to you because of the generative exercise that you take your students through. Would you mind sharing that with us?
Sure, and this really follows, Austin, what you were saying so nicely. I'll tell you about the exercise I do in a minute, but as you were speaking, it was reminding me of something else that I do in conjunction with this other exercise, which is have students build a personal universe deck. This is modeled after, Michael McClure is one who originated this, and I have an assignment that's sort of modeled after. Every student has 100 index cards, and I ask them to take them, home, away from the classroom, wherever they want to be, and come to a kind of a quiet space, set up kind of what would be a meditative space for themselves. And with a deck of index cards and a Sharpie, they are to write one word on each card that says something about their life, that represents them in some way. And it needs to be the simplest version of a word. So instead of like running or going for a run, would just be run. And some can be abstract, some can be concrete. You can use names of places or people. So they built this, and if you, Michael McClure says in his instructions, if you do it right, you get a little high from doing it, which is, it's just a really kind of a neat thing. I encourage them to do it all in one sitting if they can, and just write and flip and write and flip and write and flip. And so then to go with what you were saying, Austin, this is kind of tarot, right? So throughout the course of the semester, when they are stuck, I have, pull a card or ask a friend to pull a card or spread your deck and kind of, think about it for a second and choose a few that feel right and then turn them over and write from that. So I'm so interested in what you were saying about AI being trained on us and thinking about the way that then we ourselves also have to be trained on us sometimes to be able to kind of access our own memories and experiences. So thanks. That was a neat connection to kind of put together. The assignment that Michele is talking about is one that I came up with in that moment 18 months ago or so when everybody was panicked when ChatGPT came on the scene. I am not really, I don't do a lot with technology, usually just sort of not where I would think to go to, but I saw that and was like, okay, this is going to explode in some way or another, and I want to kind of be in front of it. So I was thinking about my intro to creative writing class, which is a multi-genre fiction, creative nonfiction, and poetry. And it is either an introduction to a major in the English department for students who are pursuing that, or fulfills an advanced writing credit at the university. So I get students who are both creative writing major bound or literature or professional writing and so on, or from every single major across the university. So it's a really interesting mix of students and a lot of fun to teach. So this is what I thought. I had always started with a poem by George Ella Lyons called Where I'm From, and as a way to have students kind of begin to kind of access their own memories to write from. So I decided to expand this, and I call it AI versus I am. So I asked students to read this poem and then to do a generative writing exercise where they fill in the sentence, I am from, as many times as they can in 7 minutes. We set a timer. I am from, I am from, I am from. And then to choose 2 or 3 of those statements that feel kind of hot and alive to them, something they really are like, oh yeah, that, I really want to write more about that, and do some free writing from that. And then to write either a poem or a short essay or a letter to the people and the places that they're from, some formal writing from this. So they do this. They bring it to class, we talk about the exercise, we share it in small groups, and then I ask them to, for the next class, to feed a prompt into an AI generator that will perhaps produce a poem similar or a piece of writing similar to what they wrote. So if they wrote a poem about growing up on a farm, wherever, I say, ask AI to write a poem about growing up on a farm in Kansas. Okay. So they do this, and they can do it a few times. And then I ask them to write a reflection before coming back to class on what happened here. And we spend the whole next class period talking about it. And it is so interesting to hear them sort of think through this. Things like, I'm jealous of the vocabulary that AI has. I wish I could have thought of this word. Okay, great. That's a great use of AI, or a thesaurus, actually, but still, yes. Or things like, I told it to write about growing up in Cleveland, and they mention, all of the places in Cleveland, but it doesn't sound like me. It's not my stories, it's not my family, it's not my people, it's not my experience. And so this really just makes a very rich and interesting conversation where they are, for themselves, sorting out in real time how they feel about using AI. So I have what the university has me have in my syllabus about academic integrity and AI, but that is as far as I go. And then the rest is sort of like, let's figure this out together. What does this mean? How can we use it ethically? Can we use it ethically? And how then also to continue to excavate your own voice, your own storytelling skills, your own vocabulary.
Excellent. Thank you. I was just saying thank you so much. It's a wonderful exercise. And it's making me think of how much, Elissa, I know you're, writing about play right now and studying play, and Austin, there's certainly an element of play. It seems like what I'm hearing from this conversation is just a lot more fun than I think has been associated with AI in what I've read and the conversations that I've had so far. So I think that's really interesting. Yeah. And I love that concept of having to be trained in us, because when was having this conversation this morning with my partner when I was telling him about this panel, and he was sort of playing devil's advocate, about the differences between a human consciousness and AI. And I was saying, yeah, but don't we all get trained up in what it, I mean, no one is developing in a vacuum, right? From the time that we're learning language, we mimic. And then eventually we develop the ability to go beyond parroting what we've heard, but that's how we all begin, right? Yeah, really interesting. Rebecca, I wonder if you would talk to us about the way you use AI and focus on the revision process, which is one of the thorniest things, I think, to teach and to help guide students through.
Yeah, I feel like my experience has been a little different in that I haven't used it at all in my writing process. And in fact, I would say, I mean, ChatGPT, one of the things is it's terrible with poetry. So when students think that it can write a poem for them, it's like, it's just so obvious. And I think I started teaching online a lot when the pandemic hit. And then a lot of students at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee have wanted to continue taking some of these lower level undergrad classes online. And so it's actually tricky, I think, or I have found it to be more tricky in my online classes than even the in-person classes, because in an online asynchronous class, I don't know, there's not the same sort of conversations that you can have necessarily, like when you're in a room together looking at each other. And in the intro class, I've had to deal with the fact that just telling students, like, don't use AI to, write your sonnet. That's just sort of like, I don't know, giving them this rule. And I really want them to start seeing like what the strengths and limitations are of this tool. So I don't mind if they use it for prompts. I mean, I think that's what I've let them do. Sometimes they feel like they don't have an idea. And I always give a lot of prompts, but they can get even more this way with AI. But I have ended up focusing more on process in my intro class as a way of, process is always what we're teaching, right? But we can get pretty caught up in the final portfolio version of things. And I think emphasizing the messiness of it and the process has helped. That's something AI can't do in the same way, right? And so at the end of the semester, I have them write an analysis of a revision essay. And what it means is they need to save all their drafts, all their research, all of their notes. And then they write like a 5 to 7 page essay, sort of bringing me through. I mean, their classmates read it too. So bringing us through the whole process. And one step in that process that I encourage them to do is to give their piece of writing to, enter it into a, ChatGPT, and see what feedback it gives them about their writing, right? Like as if it's their writing tutor or something. And actually, in a lot of ways, that I feel like that almost, first of all, they get some good tips, I guess, from it, but it also shows them the limitations in what the AI can understand, because it's not usually very helpful, and but it is interesting to sort of have another voice. So I think that could be like one component of the process. So that's where I've like explicitly invited them. I don't require it because it's complicated, right, to put their work into the AI, because then that becomes, I don't know, there's privacy issues, right? So I don't require it, but they don't seem to be very worried about like putting their work into it. So they will do that. Yeah. So I think, and I let them use like some of those writing things like Grammarly, which has a lot of AI enhanced stuff now too, can be handy as well. So
regarding the Grammarly thing, like when people are like really clutching their pearls about AI and they're really worried about it, I often remind folks that AI as a category just means any kind of machine that is mimicking the task that a human does. And it's not actually an intelligence. So Grammarly, like spell check is an AI.
Mm-hmm.
Your autocomplete keyboard is an AI. Like all of these are AIs, and they're all things that we incorporate into our normal everyday lives already. Like, no one would suggest that you write your novel without your spell checker on. You might do it for fun, or you might do it for revision, or you might do it as an exercise for like being very detail oriented or whatever. You might do it as a part of your process, but people aren't like upset about it, for instance. But if I were to take every Grammarly suggestion, for instance, I use Grammarly to just catch when I do a weird spelling of something like prerequisite in an email. I can never spell that the right way the first time. But if I were to take all of the Grammarly suggestions, I would just know I would sound like a computer. I would sound like a machine, because it's artificial. It is not an intelligence. It does not think. It does not learn. It is trained, and then output. And that's different than learning. Learning is far more messy than that.
And it doesn't actually really understand grammar. I mean, basic rules, yes, but if there's a who, it always wants a comma before it. If there are all kinds of ways in which the advice it gives is incorrect. So it's an interesting, and I guess those of us who use that, and even who rely on spell check, are keeping in mind that conundrum of, is it true or not, right? And it may not be. And so in a way, we have been trained already to be a little bit skeptical of the artificial aids to writing. Yeah.
And I find it super useful. Oops, sorry.
Please go ahead.
I find it super useful in anything to have something to push against. Sometimes it's easier to say, well, I don't want that. So what is the opposite choice that I can make? And that's like, from I'm writing against another book right now. But also like, if even at a sentence level, if I'm like, no, I don't want that. That sounds too slick. It sounds too artificial. It sounds too smooth. There's nothing to grab onto. What do I want? And that's sort of the increase of intellectual rigor superpower that this might be able. But we do it with everything. We can go write in an art museum and write against a piece of visual art if we wanted to. We can do all of this stuff. This is just another thing we can do it with.
It's interesting because what you're all saying is making me think about how much of teaching writing is about teaching agency and teaching young writers to inhabit their own voices and to take the agency and not hand it all over.
So when I teach introduction to new media. So a lot of what Jen was saying, I was like very over here, like in church, because when your output is digital, it can sometimes be really hard to make assignments that are resistant to being completed by an AI successfully. And so I've had to do like a lot of like, okay, like we are teaching process. Here's what is actually marked. Here's what the rubric, and my classes are 150 to 250 people. We do large lecture creative writing at University of British Columbia. And so I am teaching new media to 150 to 200 people. My interactive storytelling class is 100 people. And so like, I can't catch them. It's not possible. So I have to make assignments that they just can't do with an AI, or rubrics that will score them badly if they do it. So for example, we were talking about like, the AI can't really write a poem for you. It'll try, it sure will try. And one of my friends at University of British Columbia, Dr. Bronwyn Tate, is a poet and teaches the big intro poetry class, and has noticed that when poems all come in as rhyming quatrains, that's generally a sign that AI has done the work. And obviously all those rhyming quatrains, man, that's what a poem is.
It doesn't seem to understand free verse. You're like, no, but I asked for a free verse poem, and it's like, oh, I understand, and it gives you like another rhymed poem with
rhyming quatrains.
Happy endings, or like,
they're like tied up real neat, which is like not what a poem is. And like, if you ask it specifically not to do rhyming quatrains, it'll still do rhyming quatrains. It's wild. It loves those rhyming quatrains. Anyhow, back to sort of what Jen was saying about like teaching process. We do webcomics, but I have them draw on paper before they get to do it. And then I collect the paper. So that's one way, is analog that goes into digital. Another way is video assignments. I teach memes. I teach memes as camp and as folklore. And really that is secretly like how not to get radicalized on the internet in terms of like information literacy. That's my little secret uh, unit in there. And everyone thinks it's really fun because it's memes. But their project for memes is TikTok. And that's one of the projects that they can do, and they have to do a video. And they don't have to be in the video. They can have their hands, they can have other people in the video, but it is impossible to complete that task using entirely generative AI, though they may use it to assist. I tell them not to, because when we get to the end of my class, we spend like 4 weeks on AI at the end of my class because that's my research interest. And so what I have them do is I have them do all of these like analog into digital practices, and then I have them run it again with AI. So we use image generation to try to ape one of their comics. And by and large, it does not do as well. There's something that is missing from that. They do a fabulous podcast in my class, and we have them read out loud. I pick one group and they perform it for us live. And then everyone has to try to do the same thing with AI voice actors. And I will tell you, it is not as good. Even if people go in not convinced that they can perform, universally, it's like, it doesn't even matter how we did. It is not as good to hear the AI voice actors do it as it is to hear us do it. And then we end with an essay by Joaquin Ibarra called Ghosts. I don't know if everyone's read Ghosts. If you haven't yet, I suggest you do it immediately. It was in Best American Essays the year it came out. And Joaquin had pretty early access to GPT-3, I think, before everybody else did. And she used it to write this essay where she would start the AI on a pretty difficult topic for her, one that she hadn't been able to write about before. And the AI would complete it with whatever it thought it was. And Rohini would sort of move into the space it created to correct the record. So again, writing against. And we do that. We do a version of that with GPT as it stands now. And then we do ethics. So my students then have to reflect on the process of trying to ape their own stuff with AI and what that has taught them. And by and large, I also assign a couple of theory readings. I was just looking up the title when Jen was talking about AI and poetry. I assigned something called Post-Automation Poetics, or How Cold War Computers Discovered Poetry by Avery Slater. And it gives you sort of history of what AI has meant for marketing computers. It's essentially a capitalistic, like moving out of war into capitalism. And so like, what is the actual ethical framework we're thinking about? I also assigned Poetry Will Not Optimize by Michele Morano. I do sections of it because my students are undergraduates and these are pretty heavy pieces. And they have to come up with what their own ethic is. And what I found that's really funny is that my students often come down harder on AI than I do after like spending 4 weeks doing a deep dive into AI as it relates to their own creative practice and as it comes up against like what they actually made in my class. Can I guarantee that no one is using AI in the first 3 quarters of my class? No, I can't, because there's hundreds of students. And I tell my TAs not to be a cop about it either, because it's a bad use of their time. But I try to make rubrics that ask for us to be surprised. AI cannot do that on a sentence level because AI is autocomplete with the googly eyes pasted on, to quote Calvin Kostilke. So that was like a long-winded response to sort of what Jen and Rebecca were saying, and what my pedagogical practice has evolved into. And it's still evolving because the technology hasn't stopped.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. I want to just follow up your mention of ghosts by plugging. There's Wahini War also wrote a piece for Wired that is about the whole AI, her take on AI post everything that happened with ghosts. It's really fascinating. Yes, I recommend that. So thank you. Yeah. Other comments so far?
Yeah, I think I'm really appreciating what I'm hearing about using the limitations of GPT in the classroom. It's something that I've found useful too. I especially because a lot of so I teach advanced undergraduate nonfiction and graduate classes, but in the context of undergraduate teaching, probably I would say at this point, the majority of my students are newer to creative nonfiction. They're primarily fiction writers or poets. And, I think that there's something that, I certainly see it in my own writing, and sometimes I see it in theirs, a tendency to rely on metaphors that are a little bit tired or cliches in order to sort of avoid going into places that are too difficult to go, for a workshop, for, an academic experience, which I very much understand. It's something that I kind of want to bring up with students before we start talking about their work. I certainly don't want to make an example of any of my students when pointing out something that I see a lot. And I don't, I want us to talk about it without having to, talk about any specific person's work. ChatGPT is the perfect tool for this because it is a cliche machine. It's, all it wants to do is create cliches, tired metaphors. Like it's because it's made of, like we were talking about, like all it's made of the internet. It's made of all the language. And so, I'll have it generate a few paragraphs that are like riddled with cliches, and I give it some instructions. It's really fun. This is a pretty key thing for early semester, to just get everybody laughing. It's we can just laugh at how bad the language is without laughing at a person. We're just laughing at this machine. And and we can look at both the sort of most obvious instances and the ones that are less obvious because it's so baked into our language. I mean, I'm saying it, I'm using these cliches and kind of tired metaphors, in every sentence. So that's something that we do, and we try to press it to create something fresh and unique and interesting. And it can't do it. Elissa could do it, but that was because I couldn't prompt her to do anything. It was just a product of the surprise and randomness and, and like I was saying, like the sort of what I bring to it as a reader. But GPT can't do any of that stuff with like intentional humor, surprise, freshness, newness. And so, I think that like all of these things that we're talking about with relying on the limitations and teaching our students about that, I think that's really useful for them and really important. And I think, I'm always on the lookout for more ways to do that. And I also encourage, especially my grad students, I'll encourage them to play with it if they want to, especially in the ways I do, to kind of do the stuff that is, that I'll easily waste time on instead of actually writing. It's a way to push myself to write more, to think bigger, to hold more in my head, and like let some of it just live in that little sidebar on ChatGPT that has all of my weird searches.
On that note, I have a friend who has, I'm not sure what platform he's using, but he did train up, by putting all of his work in as well, and now uses it for writing query letters, and to great effect, and he said they're better than what he was writing before that. So it sounds like his voice. And, I'm trying to think like, what's the drudgery of writing that I really don't want to spend my time and intellect and creativity on, So, yeah.
Yeah. When I was writing a book proposal a year ago or a couple of years ago, I really had no idea how to write a marketing section. I had not sold a book on proposal before. And so I just asked it for examples and told it like, these are kinds of things that, that I've done in the past. And I just need an example of the form. I think it's really great for giving, just ask it to generate a stock, stock query letter to get down the conventions and the consensus on what this kind of document is supposed to look like.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah,
good at analyzing patterns. Like that's what it's for, because it's using language as data. So if you're like, what is the general pattern of this? It's really good for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for my latest book project, I asked it to write me an outline of a book on this topic. And first I was horrified. I was like, oh my God, there's no reason for me to do this. There it all is. And then I took a breath and realized that no, it was actually very useful to see what is already out there, and then to think about what is my project doing that's different, and, what components will I want to address and which ones will I want to leave. And so it was fabulous. And it took, 15 seconds. So yeah, it is good in that way. I want to, Austin, you had mentioned a couple of times the notion of ethics. And so I want us to sort of head in that direction now, if we could. And I just want to hear your perspectives on the ethical implications of both writing with generative AI and also teaching and teaching our students. Because I know there's a lot of resistance. I think there is a lot of, if not pearl clutching, then at least, hopping up on the artist stool and saying, I'm not going to deal with that mouse running around.
I was thinking about what you were saying earlier, Michele, about how we are all products of the things that we take in. In my advanced creative nonfiction workshop, I do a version of Felicia Chavez's, from her book, I just wrote down the title, The Anti-Racist Writing Workshop, which is so, so good. And she has an assignment that she calls Artistic Mentors. And I have adapted that for my class as well, in which students are identifying who and what influenced the writer that they are, what singers, what art, what other media, what have you taken in that then influences what is kind of coming out of you, and where not just like, I like the Indigo Girls, and so I write with beautiful poetry and metaphor, right? Not just that, but like, what specifically is it? So identifying, this is me, right? Identifying, they have very close, very beautiful harmony that is unexpected. And where do I see that in my writing? What kind of, where does that lead to my language choices or my propensity to write lyric essays? So asking them to do that sort of deep thinking. And I think we can think about that with AI too, in the idea that you can kind of have a conversation with it, and in a generative kind of way, not just like, but kind of like you might have with a human. What do you think of this? And here's the answer. Well, and then like a lot of you have said, sort of that pushing back against or writing against it. But I think there are ethical ways to use it in both writing and in teaching. If you are approaching it from a place of curiosity, of learning, of looking for something different, not just for looking for it to do something for you, but to maybe do something together.
Thank you.
So I mentioned before that I think there's an argument to be made for no ethical usage of some of the larger platforms. For instance, we all know that OpenAI used the Books3 database to train their transformer, and none of those works were cited or paid for. None of those authors were consulted. And that's kind of a big deal. And it feels different, by the way, in terms of like if they used my novel to do that versus if they used someone's really personal memoir about their traumatic childhood. Like that feels different in terms of like using language as data, to me at least. And so I think there's an argument to be made for no ethical usage. Visual artists say that they're often part of a corpus without their consent as well. And so like, is that like, how do you think of that? However, the reason I think it's a reductive argument, even though I think it's maybe an accurate one, is that there's no ethical usage of anything at this moment in history, particularly in digital media. So one of the things that I often talk about in my introduction to new media class is like what a computer was made for and what the internet was made for. because the internet's a DARPA project. It's a military project. Like, this is an instrument of war that we're recording this panel on right now. And so what I actually believe is that when we're given a tool that is sort of an instrument of this like large, systemic, horrible thing, war, capitalism, colonization, what have you, it is almost our duty to sort of like wrest art and nuance from it. And that is the approach that I usually take when it comes to ethics. That said, I have some pretty specific things that my students have to do and have to consider, and then they get to sort of like layer their own things on top of it. But we talk about the history of the internet, and we talk about like, you know, extraction and computers, for instance. Like, we are all doing this on computers, and the computers are pretty bad for the environment. We don't have ethical usage of anything. And so what do we do? How do we still exist in the world as it is right now? And yeah, that is, it's hard. There's no easy answer at all. But they have to cite it if they use it. If they can cite a corpus, they have to do that. With a pre-trained transformer, they can't. And we talk about the difference between using an AI where you know what's inside it and using an AI where you don't, and what the risks of that are. Using an AI where you don't know what's inside it and where it's trained on like literally billions of words has its uses too. I think of, for instance, Dr. Lillian Yvonne Bertram's work in using AI in their poetry manuscript for Diagram, A Black Story May Contain Sensitive Content, where they really use it to uncover implicit bias in a larger population. And when they change what the model is fine-tuned on, it changes what the narrative can be. And that's, you know, really meaningful. And I'm not going to say don't do that just because OpenAI is as unethical a tool as all of the other tools that we are using. It's just no easy answer. But my students do have to write a statement about it and think about it. And I feel like they are less likely to use AI in a way that is plagiaristic or in a way that reduces their art to sort of regurgitation after they think about it that hard.
Thank you. I have a very specific question. Thinking again about the essay Ghosts, which, if I'm not mistaken, went out into the world with the information that this was AI co-created, right? So my question is do you all feel that that is necessary? Like, and at what point is it not necessary, if there is such a point?
I don't know if I can identify a point at which it's not necessary. I mean, I think there is one, but I guess I'll also say that I feel like I'm, you know, I mean, I'm writing about finance. I'm writing about Wall Street, like, and, you know, corporations. Like, I'm constantly steeped in the ways that, you know, the ways that we are being exploited, our data, our lives, you know, that we are the product rather than the customer. So I think that maybe sort of flattens this a little bit for me, the sort of ethical implications. It feels like, yes, like it's a part of all of this. And so it doesn't stand out as much to me. So I guess I say that because I think, you know, I don't, you know, if I learned that I needed to, you know, explicitly cite the ways that I use ChatGPT in my brainstorming, you know, things that don't actually make it into the text of my book. Sure, I don't care. Like, yeah, I'm happy to tell. I mean, I'm telling you all this. Like, I'm happy to tell everybody. My searches are saved. I can, you know, trace my steps. And of course, I'm going to say that Elissa's text is, you know, generated using GPT. That's the point. So I think that, you know, I guess I just keep coming back to what, you know, something you were saying earlier, Michele, about creating the outline, the book outline. You know, something I think really, I guess I really fully understood in the months after my last book came out, was that the, you know, the book that I hold in my hands is not the best part, like of the whole thing of having a book. Like the reviews, the sales, the, royalties, none of that's the best part. Talking to readers, not the best part. The best part is writing it. Like that's why I do it. Because I learn, I mean, I write personal essays. I learn something about myself. I make sense of my experiences, of my world, of my miseries, and I'll explain whatever about how I use AI and that. I'm happy to do it. It's all in service. I would never steal from myself that experience of coming to understanding. And there's no way that GPT could understand for me. Like it can't. I don't know, maybe Neuralink can do that, but I am absolutely not going that far with my experimentation.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. I love that you would never steal from yourself, that there is, yeah. And that I think is something that's really important to help our students understand, right? That there is value in the process always. And the stuff that is so hard about writing is also the stuff that produces for us something that probably cannot be replicated by an artificial intelligence. I think that's a really great place to stop, even though I would love to continue talking with all of you for hours more. Thank you so much. There's tremendous wisdom here and inspiration, and I'm really excited to put some of these ideas into my own practice. So thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
Well,